Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV Friday morning. I appreciate you being with me so very much. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study of the challenge of Christ. Now, I'm going to cover a little bit today. I introduced it a little bit last week. So I'm going to discuss it a little bit more today of what I discuss in my book, The Last Days Identified. All right? I tell you, I've had just any number of people tell me down through the years, this little small book, it's not 500 pages long. It's about 137 or whatever pages long. But I have had people tell me that the singular subject under consideration in this book has been the most revolutionary thing that they've ever read. Let me state this very simply. We are told by the skeptics, the atheists, the Jews, and Muslims, that Jesus said he was going to come back in the first century. He did not do it. Now remember, the challenge of Christ is, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. John chapter 10, verse 37. Well, here's the deal. Christ, in his second coming, was supposed to appear at the end of the age, right? Everybody agrees with that. Christ, in his second coming, was to come in the last days. 2 Peter chapter 3. Everybody agrees with that, right? And so the atheists, the skeptics, etc., they tell us, now look, you Christians, you tell us that we're in the last days. And boy, oh boy, do they have a heyday with the dispensationalists, who keep telling us in every single generation, sometimes many times within a generation, hey, this is the last generation. We are absolutely positively living in the last days. And so the atheists, etc., they hear that and they say, well, okay, guess what? Jesus is supposed to come in the last days. All of you dispensationalists tell us we're in the last days and the end is near. And it keeps on not happening. Therefore, Jesus' challenge fails. And then we come to the amillennial and the postmillennial. Now, I was raised as a fifth generation member in the amillennial world. I believed that the term, the last days, referred to the Christian age. The entirety of the Christian age beginning on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, spanning until the end of time. And here we are 2,000 years later. So the explanation for that is, well, the last days is simply it's kind of a technical term for the entire span. It's the last dispensation. It's the last age. And many in the postmillennial world take the same position. Now, I believed that for an awful long time. What we have to do is to ask ourselves the question, how does the Bible actually define the last days? Well, again, as I point out in this book, and by the way, go to my website, donkpreston.com, BibleProphecy.com, order yourself a copy of this book. I want to tell you, you'll be glad that you did. I'll never forget this real quick anecdote. I had been invited to some people's house. They had been listening to my Bible classes on 2 Peter chapter 3. 2 Peter chapter 3 is talking about the last days before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. And I had gone over the definition of the last days in class. And this couple invited me over to their house. They said, Don, we want you to expound on this concept of the last days? Well, I did. I shared with them certain thoughts that fly directly into the face of the amillennial view of the last days. And remember what I just shared with you. In the amillennial world, the last days began on Pentecost and will run until the end of time. Now, what that means is, ladies and gentlemen, 10,000 years from now, or 20 or 30, amillennialists are still going to be saying, oh, see, we're in the last days. But amillennialists are absolutely loath to try to set any kind of parameter on the coming of the Lord. They just say, oh, well, it'll be at the end of the last days. Ignoring really the basic meaning of last days. Well, if you take the meaning, or if you take the terminology of last days, then folks, how can you extrapolate last days 2,000 years? Last days doesn't mean many days. So, I was sharing with this couple, and as we shared, the guy all of a sudden says, well, that does that. And I go, well, what do you mean by that? He said, well, it's real simple, Don. If we're not in the last days, the Lord has already come. If we're not in the last days, we're not waiting for Jesus to come. We're not waiting for new heaven and new earth. We're not waiting for the resurrection. Because all of those things were to occur at the end of the last days. And at the end of the last days, we enter into the new heaven and new earth. And at the end of the last days, you have the parousia of Christ. They didn't use the term parousia. But at the end of the last days, you have the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection. If we're not in the last days, we're not looking for the end of the last days. Hello? Do you catch the power of that, folks? That's so simple, but it's incredibly profound. And like I said, I have had hundreds upon hundreds of people tell me this little book, you can read this in one day. You can read it in 2 days easily. They've told me this book turned their world upside down, and then they thought about it and they said, actually, it turned their world right side up. Took away the fear of the future. So again, do yourself a favor and get that book. Now, here's what I want to say as part of this extended introduction this morning. And I want you to listen very, very carefully. If we are in the last days, the skeptics of Christ have a valid arguing point, because they know that the term last days is not a reference to hundreds of years, thousands of years. The term itself indicates an imminent end. Last days, folks, doesn't mean, to reiterate, it doesn't mean 1,000 years or 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years. It indicates that something is in its very last days. Just the term itself. Okay, so let me say this one more time. If we genuinely are in the last days, then the coming of the Lord, judgment, and resurrection should not be far off. Now, why do I say that? Because in the New Testament, the writers and the speakers, including Jesus himself, said they were living in the last days. Do you catch that? Let me expound on that just a tiny bit before proceeding. In Matthew chapter 13 and verse 17, as he begins to tell his parables to his apostles for them to understand the nature of the kingdom, Jesus said, many prophets and wise men have desired to see the things that you see, to hear the things that you hear, and have not heard them. Jesus, what are you saying? Jesus was saying that his apostles were seeing the fulfillment of what the Old Testament prophets had said. Well, listen, when it comes to eschatology, the Old Testament prophets only had one narrative. And that was, in the last days, as we shall see, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the kingdom, the new heaven and new earth would be at hand. I'll share that with you as we proceed. But let me say it one more time. The Old Testament prophets said that in the last days, they were not living in the last days. They knew they were not living in the last days, but they said, in the last days, the day of the Lord, judgment and resurrection, would be near. And it would come quickly, swiftly, and soon. Isaiah 60, verse 21 and 22. So here we have all the Old Testament prophets that said, in the last days, the day of the Lord will be at hand. In the last days, the kingdom will be established. In the last days, salvation would be placed in Zion. So all of these soteriological and eschatological tenets and elements and doctrines are posited by the Old Testament prophets as occurring in the last days. Jesus told his own apostles, living 2,000 years ago, and living before Pentecost, when the last days supposedly started. So, speaking before Pentecost and the time when the last days supposedly began, Jesus said to his apostles, you are seeing, you are hearing what the Old Testament prophets said was going to happen. That means they were in the last days before the day of Pentecost. Folks, that's devastating to the amillennial, postmillennial, and premillennial view. Now, by the way, I should point out, for integrity's sake, premillennial has come up with 2 or 3 different definitions of the last days. They tell us, well, you have the last days, that's the current Christian age in its entirety. Then you have the last generation of the last days, and that's the generation that will see the rapture. And then you have the last days of Israel. And you can find this in the book Prophecy Watch by Thomas Ice and Timothy DeMee, in which in the very, 15, 20 pages of the book, they give those 3 separate distinct definitions of the last days. So once again, folks, here's my point. And I'm telling you, this is profoundly important. What the Old Testament prophets said was going to happen in the last days, those events were taking place well before Pentecost, when the last days supposedly began. Well, if those events were supposed to take place in the last days, then they should not have taken place until after Pentecost. And yet, as just stated, those events were occurring before Pentecost. So you cannot have the last days beginning on Pentecost and not existing prior to Pentecost, and have Jesus and the New Testament writers speaking of events that were predicted to happen in the last days occurring before Pentecost. It's anachronistic. It just doesn't work. And once again, I developed this and a whole lot more in this book, The Last Days Identified. Now, let's take a look. And before I really get deeply into this, let me make a couple of observations that are critical for understanding the doctrine from the amillennial and the postmillennial view. Let me remind you that in the amillennial view especially, but it's also shared by postmillennialists. In that view, God was through with Israel at the cross. He was through with the Old Testament at the cross. And beginning on Pentecost, I've got to share this. On Facebook and YouTube, I've been having this correspondence with a guy. He actually claims to be a preterist. But he claims that the law, the Old Testament, was nailed to the cross. Well, wait a minute. If the law was nailed to the cross, then it was not effective, not binding, not valid after the cross. And yet, guess what? This guy says the judgment, the second coming of Christ, the resurrection all happened in AD 70. Oh, wait a minute. All three of those events were typified in Israel's feast days. The feast days were an integral, vital, foundational part of the law. They were a huge part of the jots and the tittles of the law. Leviticus chapter 23. And Jesus said not one jot, not one tittle of the law would pass until it was all fulfilled. So if the law contained and was constituted in large part by the feast days, then until what the feast days foreshadowed, typified, rehearsed, until what those feast days foreshadowed came to a reality, that means they were not fulfilled. Well, if they were not fulfilled, then guess what? According to Jesus, they could not pass away. And yet I constantly run into people who say, oh, the law passed away at the cross. And yet they're still looking for the judgment, the second coming, the resurrection, the new creation. All of which were predicted by the law. I mean, after all, Jesus said, the law and the prophets prophesied. So it wasn't just the prophets that prophesied. Jesus said the law prophesied. Well, how did the law prophesy? By the feast days, which foreshadowed the judgment, the atonement, parousia, and the resurrection. So there's simply no way, ladies and gentlemen, to make the argument that the law passed away at the cross and at the same time still be looking for the judgment, the parousia, and the resurrection and the new creation. There's no way to do it. You are affirming two totally separate, contradictory positions. And I've pointed out to this individual that I've been corresponding with In fact, this morning as I'm filming this, just this morning in a post on YouTube, I pointed out, you claim that the law was nailed to the cross. Yet you claim to be a preterist, and you put the judgment, the coming of the Lord, and the resurrection in AD 70. Well, that means that the law was not done away with until AD 70. Now, I posted that about, probably 3:30, 4 o'clock. Evidently, he's not up, so I haven't heard back from him. But if he follows suit, he's not even going to say a word about this. But folks, this doesn't apply only to this gentleman. It applies to the entire spectrum of amillennialism and postmillennialism. It's absolutely fascinating and somewhat troubling to me when I read the postmillennial literature. Kenneth Gentry, for instance, insists that the law, all of the ceremonial laws, which included the feast days, they were nailed to the cross, according to Kenneth Gentry. But Gentry believes that God was through with the Old Testament at the cross, including those feast days, right? But wait a minute. Kenneth Gentry is looking for the judgment, the parousia, the resurrection, and the new creation, just like this gentleman I've already mentioned. Gary DeMar argues that all of the feast days of Israel were fulfilled in Christ's first coming. Okay, then once again, the judgment, the parousia, the resurrection, the new creation was fulfilled in Jesus' first coming. Folks, are you beginning to see the power, number one, of the feast days of Israel and how they relate to eschatology? And are you beginning to see how significant and how critical it is to see the role of Israel in identifying, are you ready for this? In identifying the last days. Think of it like this. The feast days would be fulfilled when? When everything that they foreshadowed, everything they typified was fulfilled. But the feast days foreshadowed, typified, prophesied the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the new creation. Those were all, therefore, Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel in the law. Okay? Now, here's where this impinges on the challenge of Christ. The atheists and the skeptics say, well, we're still waiting for, according to you Christians, we're still waiting for the coming Lord, judgment, and resurrection. And the vast majority of Christians say, you're exactly right. Well, we are still waiting for it. But if we're still waiting for the judgment, the parousia, the resurrection, and the new creation, then we're still waiting for the fulfillment of God's Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, which you as an amillennialist and which you as a postmillennialist claim were all removed at the cross. Let me put this still another way. The final three feast days of Israel would be fulfilled at judgment, coming of the Lord, resurrection, new creation. Those are all last days events. Wouldn't you agree? Well, if those are last days events, pardon me, and if those were Old Covenant promises made to Old Covenant Israel, does it not make perfect, overwhelmingly logical sense to say those feast days and what they represented, one more time, judgment, parousia, resurrection, new creation, does it not make perfect sense to believe, to see that those things would be fulfilled in Israel's last days? in the last days of the law. I mean, after all, if their fulfillment would bring about the passing of the law, then their fulfillment would be in the last days of the law. Folks, do you catch the power of this? The entire concept of the last days being representative of or being defined as the age of Christ, the age of Messiah, won't fly. Among many reasons why it will not fly, or as my friend William Bell once said concerning a dispensational doctrine, as well as an amillennial doctrine, and he was talking about the Olivet Discourse and the attempt to divide the Olivet Discourse into two different subjects, AD 70 and the end of time. And William said, as he was discussing Noah's Ark and the significance of that illustration in Matthew 24:37 and following, William said that the argument, that boat won't float. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. Okay? So you really, really, really have to catch the force of the reality that, as I just iterated, let me repeat this. If it's true that the final three feast days foreshadowed, typified, and by the way, all scholarly sources say it's true, all rabbinic sources say it's true, okay, they foreshadow judgment, parousia, resurrection, new creation. You know, I wrote a book that was published last year, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, a study of the relationship between Israel's last feast day, Sukkot, and the resurrection. And in that book, I cite scholar after scholar after scholar after scholar, from Jewish to non-Jewish, demonstrating and proving that Sukkot, Feast of Harvest, symbolized, foreshadowed, typified the resurrection. So once again, I'm out of time here. If those last three feast days foreshadowed those things, then their fulfillment would be in the last days of Israel's age. And listen, folks, I'm completely out of time today. Get yourself a copy of this book, and I'll see you next week.